And they were singing like this: "Winos throwing frisbees at the sun." I guess so. It's already started, and talking about screaming, basically.
Like extreme vocals, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, and I think where it started was I had this idea that I was listening to Skewbald, this track. It's like two tracks in one. It was like I think Sorry or something. It's like the first part of it. I was just listening to that like tons. Like wow, like I don't know if I can think of a better satisfactory screaming, yelling, singing than Ian MacKay's delivery for like all the bodies of work he was in doing that. I want to regard that as being special because I don't typically listen to music that has very aggressive, vocals. Why is that? And that's just like, this is like a conversation right here,
Yeah.
You sent me a list of a very thoughtful list with links, like little brief descriptions, and it kind of gave me a little bit of exposure to some other examples where the vocals were kind of at this level of extreme that kind of put them in their own category.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like neat too because of the age and it's thinking about like a timeline.
Yeah. Well, that was what was like. I was thinking about it afterwards, and I was like, I don't really know how to think of like, where does this start with? Because like, and I was trying to think of it more and more, especially with the punk stuff. So it's like first wave punk stuff, the vocals might be like not traditionally good singing, but it's not really that far out of like any other style of like rock and roll of the time. It was like, you can go back to like Elvis or like old blues guys, and there's some like intensity.
Yeah.
Like, the voice breaks or like screaming a little bit, but it's like, or Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis, like all that stuff is like high energy, like up there. And then you have like a lot of early punk bands trying to kind of do that, but like they don't really have the technical ability. So it comes out in various ways, but it's still like kind of, you can still call it singing a lot of times, even though it's like not good singing. But like, even where it starts to turn into hardcore, because I was thinking of like books I've read, but it's like, okay, like the earliest hardcore records are like on the West Coast, the Middle Class, and on the East Coast, the Bad Brains. But it's like they're still like kind of singing, like it's still not really like, ah! Like and there's that Teen Idols track I put on there where it's like that's pretty early because that's pre-Minor Threat, and I think that's like. And then there's the early like Black Flag and like that scene, like Circle Jerks, but it's like it's still not that intense, but it's like there is like a kind of a line of demarcation where it's like we hit like Minor Threat and like the Negative Approach stuff there, and like it's all over the country because it's all like happening at once because it's like the kids that are getting into that stuff at that point, it's like the first wave of punk bands, those guys were influenced by 50s rock and roll. Or like jazz, like they were guys that already played other kinds of music, and it became this. If you listen to like Television and like the Stooges and stuff, where it's like you can tell they're drawing from these influences, the Ramones. But then like the second wave, when you get into like hardcore, it's like these are kids that are like they're influenced by the first wave of punk, so they're like distilling that down a little bit more. They didn't learn how to play like blues stuff or like the stuff that like Tom Verlaine did and like before Television. They just learned the first Ramones record, and then tried to do the next thing. So it's like more intense. So that drew me the parallel to like the Hellhammer stuff and some of that shit, because it's like the same way, but like with heavy metal, where it's like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and like those first wave heavy metal bands were drawing from like blues and early rock music, and they became this. But like I'm not an expert with like the metal stuff, definitely not, but like I'm imagining that like the dude like Tom Warrior and like the guys in Hellhammer, like they were probably mainly just influenced by that first wave of heavy metal, and they like learned to play that stuff, and like that's why it's like so much more primitive and like distilled down on that, where it's like they didn't have this background of like I'm gonna learn how to properly play music. It was like I'm gonna fucking like make this like heavy metal noise. So it's like it almost is like in the way like hardcore is to punk, it's like that's almost the way that like that early first wave black metal and like thrashy stuff is to metal, where it's like distilled down a little bit more. So it's like you had Motorhead in the metal world having like those gruffy vocals, but it's still like he's still kind of singing. It's still like blues based rock and roll. Like it's still like that's. I would argue that Motorhead is more of like a rock and roll band than a heavy metal band, and Lemmy would have told you that too.
The cover of the Tammy Wynette "Stand by Your Man."
Yeah.
That was like a recent Motorhead song of like listening to, and probably like listening to the podcast Cocaine and Rhinestones inspired to help me discover that, and through like the Spotify playlist, and I was like, this is awesome, and it just made me like, it just took my appreciation for Motorhead like a couple notches up, because I'm not as familiar with, but like, I wouldn't wear a T-shirt because I don't have that much of an understanding of the catalog. I'd feel like a poser essentially, but it's like a name that I regard with respect. Where I'm going like, oh, like Motorhead's cool and stuff. It's not something I never really like got familiar with. But hearing that cover, I'm just like, this is awesome, because like hearing his gruff vocals doing a female country song, it's just like, wow, this is exactly scratches just the right itch I get sometimes, where you're like, that juxtaposition there is exciting, because you're just like, it feels serious, but there's a humor to this that makes me feel comfortable.
Yeah.
So with the links that you sent me, I got a lot of I watch them on YouTube. I'm signed in, and so it affects the algorithm.
I was gonna bring that up.
So I'm like getting like one thing is like which one was it?
I noticed that today when I was revisiting them. I was like, this is recommending me some weird stuff.
Like a lot of the one was like the album cover's got like the Jesus face on it or something. I forget what. Like I've seen that one.
The Poison Idea one.
Yeah. I was seeing that one on quite a few rotations, checking in on YouTube, but it's kind of interesting because you didn't know there wasn't any Sabbath in those links, was there?
No, because that's kind of more like he's not really doing that. Like the Black Sabbath, like when they started, they were a blues band.
Yeah,
and like Ozzy's biggest influence is the Beatles.
And when I think of Sabbath, I'm not thinking of like like crazy yelling. It's like, but for some reason the algorithm on YouTube just started sending me a lot of Black Sabbath, where like subconsciously I've been thinking about Black Sabbath more. Just being like, Black Sabbath is cool. I'm like, you just look at pictures of them, and you're just going like, a character like Ozzy Osbourne, the band, and just like the lore. It's like all this stuff just kind of goes into a realm where it's hard to look at that and be like, oh yeah, like some more classic bands and stuff where you're almost like, you kind of take them for granted because of how common. But then like with Sabbath, it's just like I'll get reminded, I'm like, Master of Reality or whatever. I'm like,
that's
oh man,
burner. Like I've always loved Sabbath, and then recently I've had a little bit more of like an early Ozzy renaissance, because it's like there was a point probably like 10-15 years ago where it's like you kind of write that stuff off a little bit because Ozzy was becoming this like kind of cartoon pop culture icon. And like you think of that stuff as a little more cheesy, and some of the songs got overplayed on radio, especially like later stuff like No More Tears and whatnot. It's like just like I associate that with like being a kid driving around with like 98 Rock on. So it's like I don't think about it as
I'm coming
that
home.
one. It's honestly, ironically, written by Lemmy.
Really?
Yeah, made him a shitload. I think he made more money off that than he made from any Motorhead stuff. But
So it's crazy because I would have thought he wrote that, because isn't it like half like an ode to his wife?
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I don't think he wrote most of his stuff.
It's crazy. And then Lemmy like, I want to write you a song that's an ode to your wife.
Because in Black Sabbath, Geezer Butler wrote the lyrics, at least the lion's share of the lyrics. And then I know on the first two Ozzy records, the bass player in that band wrote most of the lyrics. Or like, Ozzy I don't think wrote hardly anything.
So he was contributing the vocal performance.
He's a singer, and he's the name on the thing. And I think in the liner notes, there's a writing credit, but I think like didn't actually really write a whole lot of it. Maybe came up with melodies, stuff like that. But yeah, those first two Ozzy records are killer too. And then even like at Bark at the Moon has some tracks on it. Like it's cheesy, but like heavy metal's cheesy. Like it's just kind of, that's part of it. It's like wrestling, it's like it's a little. The cheesiness is a part of it. Like that's, accepted.
Well, in the 80s, I think too, just like the sort of the changing of times technology wise and formats and sort of like digital, it just seemed like everything was kind of going through a transformation that, once may have been dressed a different way. So like the 80s create this very distinct sound for a lot of bands. And a lot of times that sound may have been like not as, as different, and people, almost just, it's that, that album's the least liked or something, or it was laden with 80s stuff, like the the gated, the snare,
Yeah.
reverb, or like just synthesizers that are just such a sound of that time.
Yeah.
Like a DX7, like like pads and like.
And that bleeds into a lot of this other stuff too, because like with the punk, when I was initially trying to put that list of links together, it was like I'm trying to think of like what's hardcore and punk stuff that like really does have those vocal elements, but also like what is not full of like 80s recording trappings.
Yeah,
and like some of it is because those kids, depending on where they were, they would go to a studio where it's like the studio does not understand what they want, and they're just giving them what everyone else at the time wants. So it's like you get a lot of like big reverb snares on like some of those punk records.
Like what? Like I feel like does Dag Nasty kind of have some? Maybe
Not hugely, because those are all the DC stuff is done at that one place that they're all. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but throw me in the poser disposer because. It's the place just recently shut down. Like the guy sold all of his stuff. Don Zientara is the guy's name, but I'm trying to think of the name of the studio. But all that stuff, he did almost all that stuff.
So that probably wouldn't have been an example. I'm trying to think of like there's a band that's like in a sort of realm where I'm like, I think of like Replacements having that sort of thing where they're like had a lot of strong, a lot of action in the '80s, and there is a lot of things there that from those songs I feel like has been talked about where it's like the horns or something, and what Can't Hardly Wait, where it's like a sound that's like very distinctive and unique, but it's also kind of like interesting when you hear things when bands reflect on not liking albums that were recorded because of a sound, and you're like, that's the only way I know that, and it's like I like that, but then it's sort of strange because it's like I guess it's like, well, they may not have been in. They're the band, but like there's a lot of hands that get involved with producing an album that's on a label of a certain degree. So you're gonna have like engineers, and you're gonna have people that have ideas that you might just be like, hey, I'm just gonna go with the flow of the person that knows what they're doing behind the console or something.
Yeah.
One thing too, while I was listening to some of the examples that you'd sent me, was like just thinking of other examples that like reaching out from that, and I had two earlier, I think, in thought. I did write stuff down. One example I remember thinking of was like in the beginning. I think it's an Angel of Death in the opening of Rain and Blood, Slayer, like that. Yeah, that scream. The first time I heard that, I thought it was a guitar.
Me too.
And it was just like when it came down and you're like, that's a voice. You're like, this is, wow.
And that's like in the metal side of stuff. There was some stuff that I was listening to a little bit on my way here too that I hadn't put on that thing. I was just kind of thinking about it because it's like, so on that list I sent you, I think I've got, God, I always forget the goddamn name, Terrorizer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that's that early, in America, the early wave of like, grindcore and death metal starting, but a little bit before Terrorizer. I think Terrorizer started a couple years before that recording, because a couple of those guys moved to Florida and end up part of Morbid Angel and like that Florida death metal stuff. But those guys all that stuff is branching out of that Slayer stuff because they're hearing the Bay Area thrash stuff that's really fast, like Slayer and Metallica, and they're just like upping it another level. So like, there's Terrorizer. I like that Terrorizer record. A lot of the stuff that I send you metal wise, I don't really listen to that much, or like not more than like I don't think I made it through a track of most of those. Mm-hmm. But it's like just I know what it is. But like the Terrorizer record I like a lot. But then before that, there's another band called Repulsion. That's another record that like was recorded then, but like never came out until later. And then there's Death. Like, and that's like coming out of what you're talking about with Slayer.
Yeah.
It's like those guys are hearing that and then they're just like turning it up a little bit more.
Thinking of like this approach of like the intense vocals and that like there are examples, trying to think of examples, and thinking of these examples as being ones that you might be like fond of, and then trying to think of like, what would be examples where it's like it's not going well, or like the screaming really is like not good? And it's recently Kevin Albin showed me a video. I think it was him. And then I think I saw like a clip on YouTube, and I didn't watch the whole thing, but it was a guy talking about like Kurt Cobain singing, and it looked like he was showing this example of a YouTube video that Kevin showed me where it's like the dude from what was it, like Puddle of Mud or
Yeah,
something,
yeah.
doing one of these like Nirvana songs, and his delivery of it is very intense in a way where it's like, you know, you're like, is it intentionally like this, or it's like puts a smile on my face because you're just going like, wow, this is crazy, you know, like I don't know why this is just so crazy sounding, but you're just going like, this is like, is it a fine line or is it not? But it seems like it'd be really easy to do it wrong, but I
Yeah.
can think of far more examples of it being done where it's like awesome, but like maybe that just kind of like thinking of the cream and knowing that amongst the awesome is also just a lot of like subpar. It might not just be as
I mean, I think it's definitely a skill, and like it's hard to do. It's hard to, I think, get yourself in the mindset where you can do it with like I mean, I never got good at it, but with like just being able to like push out that much, like
yeah.
and also not hurt yourself.
Yeah, every time I even try,
Yeah.
I'm like, even just a few syllables, I'm just going, I couldn't
'Cause
imagine.
a lot of like the really like the death metal-y stuff or like grindcore or like all those, it's like they're not even like that loud. They're like doing a thing with their throat
Yeah.
to make that sound. They're like, you can learn. There's videos that'll teach you how to do it on YouTube. It's weird. But then there's other ones where it's like they're clearly like that guy in
Destroying
Poison
their-
Idea is clearly like belting it the fuck out, like, and or like John Brandon in the Negative Approach stuff, like that. I've seen that guy, like he's like pushing it out. He's the real deal.
It's like incredible to imagine how that singer would have handled like touring or doing
Yeah.
strings of shows where you're playing like back like this night, next, you know, like multiple nights where
Yeah.
you'd be like, man, if I like did one song like that, it would thrash my throat and be sore, let alone do a whole set of that, and then the next day do it again. Like your voice would be all raspy
Especially
the next
like at
day.
this point, that guy still is doing that.
they,
Like,
they like it, if you don't, it's almost just feels like you really have to find the art of it, but it's different for every set of
Yeah.
you know, chords, you know, like it's almost like you have a range, you have to learn your range, and then like probably and understand some kind of like techniques to help from you destroying your voice every, you know, to the point where you can't use it again the next day or something.
yeah.
That's a skill, and it's like I
Yeah.
feel like people could probably overlook it. Well, so like then like what about like other genres then? So like a lot of this is like sort of like some like rock oriented stuff, you know. But what about like hip hop? And you know what I think of a lot, and I kind of like want to do with like a recording one day and like try to capture it. But the Beastie Boys, what is the beginning of looking down the barrel of a gun?
Yeah.
Ah!
Yeah.
Just a yell where it's almost like I hear that in my head, and it's such has like it's burned in my brain as like this like entrance, like this call, like it's starting, and it's like the whole like movement of that yell, you know, when it ends, the way the song starts, and it's like sort of like this like
Such a banger.
yeah, like
So good.
it's like it's almost like using the scream as like almost like a particular instrument, but not through the whole song, but almost like as like a horn stab.
Yeah.
You know, like and yeah, and that I guess that isn't a hip hop example though, because that song being they're playing like instruments and stuff
But it's
with
still like, I mean, that's a rap record. It's
Yeah.
a hip hop record. It's I'm trying to. I hadn't really thought about gruff vocals in hip hop, and I'm not as well versed as you. But like, this is like what Onyx
yeah,
or like
you know, some rappers, you know, like in the late '90s had like a you know,
Yeah.
like what you know, Tupac got pretty aggressive, but then you had like DMX, and then you
Yeah.
had like then after you know, you had Ja Rule, and then like you had these guys they had like some pretty deep registers and be like half like you know pretty distinctive aggression to their delivery.
yeah.
Nowadays, I think it was like so many years ago, there was this one rapper, like he was very colorful, Tekashi 6ix9ine or something. And I remember being like, after seeing the name or enough, I was like, I went to go check out like what's one of his songs sound like? And it was very just like barking words, just like, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh. And like, you're just going like, whoa, like, this is like very intense, you know, and almost like yelling, but yeah, it's just like single words or something.
I the other day. It's not the other day. It's probably like 6 months ago. I had a kick where I was listening to a bunch of Ghetto Boys and like Scarface.
Ooh.
And like,
Yeah, his name's Brad.
did not know
I
that.
think his son's name's Brad. I could be
Wow.
wrong. Maybe someone will fact check me. I'll learn that I'm wrong. But I
But,
remember
like,
picking it up on him and be like, well, his name's Brad too.
some of that shit is like fucking scary. Like, you know, like, and then a lot of hip hop of the time had that element to it. But like, you go back to it, it's like, this is still like, whoa. And like, they could take it to cartoony levels too, where it was like just not. But like, there's some of it you listen to, you're like, whoa. And we were driving around, and because Megan knows a little bit more of like current hip hop stuff, and I was like, are rappers still scary? Like, is it still like this? And she's like, no, I think like now they're mostly just horny. And I was like, I guess that makes sense. But I was just like, they made me think of that of like late 80s, early 90s, up until a certain point, probably through the late 90s, DMX was still like pretty hard. But I was like, there was a era where that shit was like scary. Like the songs were about like intense stuff and like a lot of like violence.
It's weird because like in the 80s there was very little of that, but like by the late 80s you had like the Compton, you know, like you know, gangster rap getting big by late 80s. You know, it's like I think of CB4.
Yeah. Yeah, I never saw that movie, but I remember the previews.
I do highly recommend. I've got it on VHS. It's a classic. It's like one of those movies where there's a lot of like memorable parts where you'll just like a Friday, you know, where you can hear it in your head real well and it'll make you laugh. But yeah, and so like then it was like, but then by like the early 90s that was like out of style, but it turned into like something else where it was a little bit more like Wu-Tang. It's like you think about like New York and you think about like the culture of these like groups from certain areas and really just bringing up things that are you believe to be real. You go into a place and you might be held at gunpoint because of either the colors you're wearing or the thing that you're wearing, and they might want to take it, or just coming up in the streets and just like how dangerous it sounds. And it's like very alluring because you know you're coming from a place of safety, so it's like exotic, and you're like, you know, you feel like you're learning and like being exposed to this culture that you kind of have the privilege of not having to be in, like they are coming from, and then sort of telling you this story. But then like by like the late 90s it went to the next level where like when you have rappers like DMX and you're seeing those like these videos where there's leagues of men on like four-wheelers and dirt bikes riding them like professionally, or where they're like doing a wheelie on it. You're going like, I'd crack my head the first time I would try that and never try again. And they're like, they look like so skilled and tough to be able to just be like driving through like the city like on a wheelie on a four-wheeler showing off, and you're just going, these guys would, it's like I wouldn't last a second out there, man. I'd be dead meat, man. I'm like I feel like such a wimp watching this, you know?
Yeah.
But then, you know, it's like, I don't know, then you had the 2000s and everything. I mean, because the 90s had the glossy hip hop, Mace and, you know, and stuff. But like by like the 2000s, it seemed to be like getting more into like fashion, and like, so like Kanye comes about and he's like kind of bringing backpack culture with sort of more like fancy, you know, like like fancy stuff, you know, where it's almost not R&B but kind of like R&B. And like by the 2000s it seemed to like less and less of that aggressive stuff. But I think like current modern times it's probably harder than ever to pull off the tough guy thing, because it'd be so easy for people to like check you, you know? So it's like, unless you're actually doing that bad stuff, you know, it's almost like you have to
that's the thing you learn, like reading about those guys from like the early 90s and late 80s, is like not many of them were really like involved in that stuff.
Yeah, and like they, you know, they may have had like a grasp on it because of the exposure, but like used like creativity to add this vibe to it. But like nowadays it's like boiled things down where it shows things in a way where it's like look at me, I'm distinctive, you know, like I'm crazy, dude. I got face tats everywhere, you know, like it's over with. You know, this is my life, you know. And they're like maybe not even in their 20s yet or something.
I was thinking about that the other day because I didn't think about it long enough to actually look into any of it. But do you remember a rapper called Stitches that popped up on the internet probably like 7-8 years ago?
No,
It was a
I'm.
different time. It was a white kid. I think he was from Florida, and he had tons of face tattoos and like stitch tattoos on his face.
Oh yeah. Like
And the
a
song,
Joker kind of like.
yeah, and the song was called "Brick in Your Face." And I think he had like one or two other ones, and he like toured around and like it was a big deal for a minute. And then like I don't know whatever became of him, but it's just like, man, that is a commitment. Like he was young, he was
Yeah.
not very old, and it was just like covered in tattoos on his face and rapping about like selling coke. Like I think every other song, like the brick in question was a brick of cocaine.
Yeah.
Uh, and like every other song's about that, and it's just like, where are we going from here? Like what's the second record about?
Like it's just it feels like your time to shine is smaller than ever.
Yeah.
Where like it's not. It's like it's almost like it's not the same as it was 25 years ago with like you're a one-hit wonder. It's almost like you can
1 month wonder.
yeah, like you can spike up so much quicker and drop off so much harder, and it just like come and go. Yet at that peak, it looks like you're on some level where you're not going back, and then it just like
Doesn't work that way.
they just disappear, and it's
Even then, like at his peak, I remember, I don't know that he actually played the show or if it got booked or if the guy was just talking about it, but somebody on the internet was talking about booking him at Baltimore Soundstage. And it's like, that was at the dude's peak. And that's like 1,000 cap room. And it's like, that's not that big of a peak.
oh another thing too is like the reality of you not doing well and people being able to show that. So like
Yeah.
imagine if you're like you're Mr. Rapper, you got like this confidence, you're just like, oh, I'm like the shit, and then like you're doing like a string of shows and there's like 6 people at that show and like someone's taking a video like this is what so and so show looks like. They're always talking all this shit like they're like so
Yeah.
big, look at this.
Yep.
And then that like it feels like it's harder to fake it now, but
Yeah.
yet at the same time there's a lot of still that like weird stuff. It just seems like it looks so phony to me, but yet it's super popular, and I'm like I'm just like disconnected. But I don't know. I feel like though of music that I've gotten into that's new, it's like primarily hip hop. Like
Yeah.
if I were to like make someone like a mix CD right now, it would just be all like I feel like hip hop. Like I've listened to these examples so many times. I'm definitely confident that these are super cool, and I'll share them with somebody. And it's like most of it's like a certain format I'm noticing. It's like it's hip hop, but it's like I actually so recently I've been kind of like in a rut creatively in a way. Like I've been doing like more recording than ever, and yet feeling like this like almost like bipolar with it, where it's like just days where you're just like I have no vision of future, or like I don't understand what I'm doing,
Yeah.
or just like I'm like wanting my friend to come over, one of my friends that plays music, and like well then I can record them and like that get excited at the thought of that potential.
Yeah.
But I'm like I think one of my issues in this space is focus and being distracted with a lot of different stuff. And so, like, sometimes doing creative work, but being distracted, it fucks the flow up,
Yeah, absolutely.
You start, you got straighten some of your kids out or something, like you thought they had it under control in their little environment, and you're just going like, whatever happens, it's my fault because I'm responsible. And then all of a sudden, like, your vibes are off now. You go back and you sit down and you're just going like, I just need to turn this crap off, and I go do my chores or something,
Yeah.
So, like, the work that I'm doing, it's like trying to find work in the studio that is like puzzle building, like
Yeah.
where you can walk away from it or be distracted, and you're making progress, but it's not so much dependent on being in a vibe,
Right.
So one of the things I've been doing is making these things called song maps, where I basically in the past it would be like I'm doing a cover, and in the process of figuring the song out, I would use graph paper and like use the blocks as like a representation of say like one measure or two
Yeah.
measures, and I would like, for example, like a Beck song, take a Beck song, and then you start really analyzing it. You're going like, this is just like 5 loops. There's a
Yeah.
bass loop. The bass never changes. The bass never stops, or the drums stop, but it's this other drum part, and all of a sudden you're going like, I can understand this song in a way now where I know all the elements and I can hear them all separately, and suddenly like use like your graph paper, like one row of colored blocks represents the vocals, which are only on these parts, and then you realize that, well, look, oh, they're doing 16 bars. oh, you start seeing like patterns and like the way different artists are grouping. Like another thing I'm noticing is in the 90s, everything was just longer back then. It
Yeah.
was just everything was longer. Like, it's like, Jesus, this song's 4.5 minutes long. I got the point like 2 minutes in. And so that's one of the things I'm noticing with a lot of the new hip hop that I've been into for years now, accumulating these specific examples, because it's not always like the whole album rules and the whole album sounds like that. But then I'm starting to know like the songs that I like are done by a particular producer.
Yeah.
And then you're also going like all these songs from different artists and different producers, like you sort of compare them. So that's what I've been doing recently. I kind of made like a playlist of like these, what are the songs that have been like really inspiring to me, and they've been songs that are kind of built with like really minimal elements, loops and things. And so I was like, a lot of times I struggle where I create something and it might be 2 or 3 elements, but it might only be like 2 measures worth, of like ingredients. How do I make that interesting without feeling redundant or monotonous? And so these hip hop songs sometimes it's just a fucking loop, the whole song, and you're just going like, how are they pulling it off? And so what I've kind of come to the conclusion is obviously it's going to be the rapper's voice,
right,
and that's a huge part of it. So if you don't have like if you haven't honed that instrument in, you don't know what you're doing, you don't have confidence there, I feel like you got to own it, and that like the character in the rapper's voice is such a huge part of taking a basic mashed potatoes beat and just making it like cool as shit, because they have the flow and the what syllables and the way they change words and all the creativity with delivering words. It's just such a huge thing where all of a sudden you're not focused on the fact that part is just being looped the whole song. It never even changes. There's no B part. And you're like, wow. And I didn't get bored, but songs are also less than 2 minutes. And so I started realizing, I'm like, I like songs that are like short attention span, where there's like a lot of them don't have choruses. That's another thing. Like in the 90s, you're like, oh, like all songs just seem to have choruses. You got to have verses and choruses, and the way you have them doubled up or back to back, that's like, how you can change it up. But they always just seem to have choruses, where a lot of this newer stuff that I've been getting into, it's just like 16 bars and they're done. And they get in, they get out. They got an interesting beat and other things that make the beat interesting, even though it might just be 1 or 2 basic loops, are simple like effects like drops.
Yeah.
Like it'll be like, a drop right after the 3 on the measure, and it comes back in before the 1 on the next measure. And when that music drops, whatever they're saying really comes out, and what they're saying might be just something memorable that you like or whatever, but like it almost just feels like it doesn't matter if it's important or not. By dropping the music out, it brings attention to the voice and helps you almost be riding the vocals and not be focusing on a monotonous drum loop,
I used to like to do that when we would do Boss DJ stuff at Spargo's, and you had that mixer where you could like duck out the bass.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I ever got good at it, but I should just play with it after I had a few too many of those free beers. And just like, if it was getting to like a good line, like dip out the bass. So it was just that. And I don't think anybody noticed because they were all playing beer pong and fighting. But like,
sounded cool.
It was fun.
Yeah.
It was just like it was like a low stakes way to experiment with that stuff. Because if you like screw it up, like no one's gonna notice or care.
Yeah, I mean, like, and it's like it's those little bits of seasoning that like can really liven up something too.
Yeah.
It's like really just simple like little production moves.
When I was getting into trying to learn to record stuff on my iPad and I was watching videos about it, there was a guy that talked about that stuff. I guess it was more in the sense of like, it was videos about mixing, but I guess at this point he's getting into a little bit more producing. But he was like, one thing you do at a certain point is start sweetening, as he called it, where it's like the second verse should have something that's not in, like, it's a little different from the first verse, whether it's like there's a guitar part going under it, or
a little extra like, percussion,
a tambourine, something, and do the same thing on the second chorus. Like, it's just another element that wasn't there, because like people's ears get tired, or like they start to zone out when there isn't a new thing.
Yep.
And I was like, I'd never thought about that, but then I went back and listened to like a lot of songs I love. It was like, oh yeah, that is going on. Like, the exact same things, like a tambourine came in here, or like this or that, but it's like you didn't really notice it until you're like really like trying to pay attention. But it does like help the song build and like become a bigger thing by the time it's over.
Sometimes instrumentation too. Another one that kind of made me think there was like when songs use something where you only you only use it once. There's like this thing that it's like this little variation in the sound that occurs, and it catches your brain, in a way. It gets its attention, but it isn't necessarily pulling away from maybe what you want the listener to really be focused on, which is like usually the vocals.
Yeah, that stuff. I mean, that's this. I think of like, or even something like only comes in at like the very end of a song, where like saying that made me think of like the very end of like Beck's Loser, when like that like real distorted guitar comes in it, but it's in the background. It's not even like it's at the very end of the song, but it's just such a distinct thing, and like it was clearly like a conscious choice made to like do that. So
I did a cover a couple weeks ago tried doing a cover of Beer Can by Beck, and that song has this sound to it that's like the driving element of that song, which is like this reversed, like kind of like guitar thing.
Yeah.
And if you don't nail that, it really falls short on the cover sounding right. But it's like not a traditional sound that you could emulate, because it's almost like if you reverse it, it's still not clear as to what's going on there with like a guitar or the instrument. But like that's what that is. But then when it's reversed and you hear it in the song, it really is like the driving hook. But like the bass and the drums, those are easy enough, and it's like nothing changes about the bass line. It's like 2 notes, big blown out drums. But man, that one was fun. And it was like long as shit. It was like 4 some minutes long or whatever. And yeah, like there are lyrics in that song. I'm like, I've heard this song a lot of times, and I'm like, I never knew you sang that. When I looked up the lyrics, like, dude, like when the chorus or when it like really drops in, it was like, and they were singing like this: winos throwing frisbees at the sun, put my soul between a bun. And I was like, winos throwing frisbees at the sun? I'm like, there's a part of me that wants to just go on the internet and just put that somewhere. Yeah. And I'm like, I'm not going to go do that. Like, where like the lyric is so inspiring to me, where I'm just like, make everyone like read those lyrics because it's so stupid. I love it because it's like ridiculous. It paints such a silly picture, and it's like one of the reasons I really am a big fan of Beck is just those songs with, there's a lot of them, like in his earlier days, where lyrics were just so weird, and it was like you didn't even have to understand the song, but you didn't feel like you stupid, like you didn't get it or something. Yeah. And it was like I've heard these lyrics so many times and never thought about them. And I read that line, I was like, I've never heard him say that, but now I hear it. I know he's saying that. I'm like, it just always went over my head, just like some Beck talk or whatever.
It's awesome.
Oh, another thing too with those song maps I was noticing was, like trap. Trap's been, it's that genre's been, it's down. They're so, like, here.
What is? I've heard that phrase a million times, but I have no idea what it means.
All right, so like my understanding, when I think about trap, I think about more modern and typically what's like currently the sort of like popular sound and form of hip hop. But once upon a time, it was like CD and like this sort of like underground version of it happening regionally, and maybe not, I would say like one area was the pioneer, but like, in the 90s in the South, they were doing a lot of things that sound very similar to what we think or what we hear now that would be called trap. And for me, one thing I always think of when I think about trap, like music, like hip hop beats, is those hi-hats spraying,
16th note,
like 30-second note. So you can get like really fast rolls, but like changing up the notes and when they follow on. But what I was noticing is like a lot of these songs are like mid 70s tempo. So like let's just say like trap is like 74 BPM. That's what it's like a slow thing, right, but it gives you this like platform to go either direction, to be it's like it's really easy to be at that tempo and to deliver the slow raps that would match that beat at that tempo, or if it was twice as fast, you like fast rapping, and either way it sounds really cool over top of that drum beat, which is actually like 74 or whatever. Yeah. But you might like speed a sample up and the sample's moving at like 148, but the drums are hitting at 74, and then the rapper can like, just like the hi-hat, change like their flow, and it's like, I think, easier to kind of go between those two things, and just like it feels like it could be a lot more fun versus you start to get up to like maybe like in the 90s and stuff, and it's almost kind of harder to think of rapping at that BPM or double it, or whatever,
Yeah.
because it's like super fast or something. But I don't know, like trap to me is usually just like, it's like modern, it's like electronic beats. It's like, fast hi-hats. That's like, I think of them as spraying. Like they almost like tick, 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 tick. And
Yeah.
it's it's almost like a rotary phone, like clicking back, like
Yeah,
or something
yeah.
like that. But like the word trap, it's like it's something to do with like these like abandoned houses where they're like selling drugs out of, and it's like the trap house, and it just seemed to be like correlating with that. But like to me, I think of trap too as like the grandfathers of trap would be, like these artists in the 90s. So a big one to me, I would be like 3-6 Mafia.
Okay.
Yeah, like 3-6 Mafia definitely had a sound that like southern rap that just seemed to be such an influence to like the modern sound of hip hop. And there was like a lot of stuff happening kind of like in the early 90s where like they were kind of like utilizing the 80s stuff, like drum machines, and like creating a sound that was different than what they were doing with that same equipment in the 80s. And so like it started to create this like like the stuff that was happening in the 90s that felt like the South rap.
So like the drums are less sample based, more like electronic sounding.
Yes. Yeah, everything seems to be like, it's like when I think of trap, I'm not thinking dirty samples and lo-fi hip hop. It's almost like the opposite of it. And the examples I'm kind of finding are almost kind of like blending these elements together, where it's almost like it doesn't have like the trap hi-hats, and but yet it seems to have like the bass tempo, and the way you can kind of play with that with your drums. A lot of these examples too, it's like there's like this thing where I'm hearing more in hip hop beats, and it's weird because when you actually pay attention to it, it's like there's like no, this is really basic. There's no really extra drums here. It almost just feels like they took a soul sample, chopped it up on eighth notes, rearranged it, and it just sounds cool as shit. And the drums are just the native drums from that sample, and it's almost like a drumless chopped up soul sample is like a formula for like a certain kind of sound that is really appeasing to me right now, because it's almost like a throwback to the stuff that I really, really fell in love with in the earlier days of my interest with hip hop. But like nowadays, it's sort of like pretty niche sounding, and that like if you do stuff, it's like it's been like the trails have been blazed already. So like if you do something that sounds lo-fi, you're probably going to be associated with sounding like this or that, Jay Dilla or Madlib or MF Doom, like those names have struck. They laid it down where like if you do that stuff, it's like, oh, it sounds like a Madlib type beat. It sounds like something off of Mad Villainy. It's like certain things were done in rock where it's like once those things got done, it's hard to do that again without being compared to those things. And it's kind of even harder to do them and be authentic, or and have your own way of doing it. But I don't know. I just feel like I'm just sort of a sucker for a lot of that, the stuff that seems kind of like it's incorporating the elements of like the old school samples, and like it kind of blows my mind, because I'm like, I kind of thought everything was going away from that because of just how hard it is to sample copyrighted material and to get that material out there without being problematic. Because even nowadays, it's like you could just like, I'm a nobody, right? I put a beat up I made that's got samples in it, and it's like it's going to get strikes, or like it gets taken down. It's like it's happened to me. Like I've put videos on Instagram and it instantly got like, oh, well, it's got content in there that's copyrighted. YouTube, they'll pick up on you listening to something in the background while you're videotaping you working on electronics, and it's like, I wasn't even thinking about me monetizing someone, that had that music playing in the background. That's what I was listening to when I was trying to make my own content, and I realized I'm like, I can't have that, So if you're making music that's sampling, it's like, oh, you're going to run into problems. So like, it just seemed like the general consensus was moving away from that. So when you hear examples of it now, and they're doing that, like this guy's rapping over top of this is obviously a sample, I don't know how they're pulling it off, if they're doing it legally or what, but I'm like, it's almost like they're bringing it back or they're somehow defying the system or something. But like, it's like, those are the examples. I'm like, a lot of these things I made song maps of are stuff that's like sample based.
Yeah.
But I mean, when I got into, so like, you remember like Odd Future and Tyler, when all that stuff came out, like that was kind of like where I was at, like was thinking that sampling was just like over. Like if you're using samples, you're just like, you're making your grave because you can't put it anywhere unless you've made it, you've cleared stuff. I don't know, it was just kind of weird because I was still into sampling, but then when when the Odd Future was like, when I just was discovering this entourage, I was like, man, this sounds like they're making these beats on like a laptop with like probably like pirated software, and it's like there isn't any Mojo hardware going on here. They're just like figuring it all out and probably using a trackpad to build it, like instead of a mouse. And it's like, and it changed my mind and perspective where I was like, that stuff can be cool. It almost seemed like the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, like hip hop got all glossy and just like all like just like big production and not dirty loops on samplers and stuff. And I was just like not really interested in that vibe. But they kind of were making those sounds, but like in a dirty, grimy way.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, maybe I can make cool beats just using all soft synths in my recording program, and I just make little melodies and just put drums, and I hand punch the drums like I'm MF Doom. And it really made me open up to like using like synthesizers and trying to like, make beats where I was using instruments versus just trying to make collages of samples. And then, like it seemed like on a lot of that stuff kind of like I lost interest in, but like Earl Sweatshirt was one that I just like.
I think I might still have one of his records.
I got
sold it. I can't remember.
So like it was like I stayed paying attention to his stuff, and I thought it was like superior, and like scratched it was the most interesting. And then like stuff Tyler was coming out with, I was listening to and trying, but it wasn't. It was like it was almost like just wasn't sticking, and I just wanted to like it, and it just felt like I felt aligned with it, but it just wasn't really having tracks that I was like wanting to return to.
Yeah.
But with the Earl stuff, it was like that. And I was trying to do like covers of the Earl songs. Tangent. Not a lot of covers in hip hop. Yeah. It's like that could be like a whole nother conversation that could, episode wise. But, like, and it was weird because like at an early stage, you realize like this guy's a kid, and it's like, you're like, if you stay following with him, he's like growing up, and you're like listening to his development. And in like 2018 or 17, I guess maybe it was 18, his album Some Rap Songs. It's real short. It's like, I think it's less than 30 minutes. It's like maybe like 25 minutes. I bought it on tape from a website that I just remember just being like, is this the real website? Like it just felt like for like the level of this dude's like notoriety, it was almost like it just felt like, is this like an official website? I don't know what's going on here, but this is where you apparently go to buy the merch and the record or the music. And I chose to get the tape version instead of vinyl or the CD package or whatever, if there was a CD package at the time. But I listened to that shit a lot. Side A flips over side B, and it's so short, right? There's just something that really stood out to me about that album. But I'm going to go on record and just saying that that's one of my favorite hip-hop albums. And the fact that came out that long ago now for me, and it still holds that place, says something. Because a lot of the stuff I got into in the past, like say like the Odd Future stuff, I feel like since I've become a parent, it's just a lot of stuff has changed. I can't listen to a lot of that stuff. Like I like Lil B. There's a lot of Lil B. He's very what's the word? Prolific in his in his catalog. And in a time in my life, probably about a decade ago, I was just like downloading all those albums off of Dat Piff, and like I would comb through them, and it was just like maybe one or two songs stood out to you, but they were really good. And all of a sudden I just had like a lot of songs from his catalog because he just had so much to comb through. So like I'm listening to Lil B now, and I'm like, I can't listen to Lil B now because there's so much profanity and the stuff he's saying. I'm like, the kids are right around the corner. I can't explain. I don't want them to be hearing that language.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
A lot of stuff, it's kind of changed. So like music that's come into my life with like having kids in the house, it's like past certain tests, you know?
Right. Well,
Or-
yeah, because it's the same thing. Like, speaking of Tyler, the creator, like I had an album Goblin,
oh yeah.
and I think I played a track or two off of it when I used to DJ at the Circle. But it was just like it's hard because there's so much of like the F slur,
Yeah.
and it's just like I don't want to play that in public. Like I don't,
Yeah.
that's gonna bother people, and like
Yeah.
I don't want anybody to. And then I was in a bar the other night. I was at the place in Gettysburg after I got off working at the tap room, hanging out with a dude I know who's like an older black dude. He's like in his mid-50s, and like there was a song playing when we were outside that had a lot of like the M-bomb in it. It was like a hip hop song, and he like made him turn it off. He was like, I was like, I don't want to hear that. I'm out. That's an unacceptable term. And I'm just like, makes you think about it because it's like it's in so much hip hop. And I thought about it too because when I'm working in the tap room, if it's a Tuesday night and I'm taking in records to play, it's like I don't want to take in stuff that's got like a bunch of that, and it's like that rules out like so much of my like hip hop stuff. It's like I love. It's definitely all over like the Chronic, so it's like we pretty much ruled that one out. It's all over. I'm pretty sure it's all over 36 Chambers. I have like a censored first ODB album, but it's still like all over that.
Yeah.
It's just like I can't play really any of this shit. Like I could bring in maybe like Tribe Called Quest. It's probably still on.
Yeah, that's the first. I was thinking like Tribe Called Quest or like De La Soul as an example because it's like this is like that's like some like
It's probably still in that somewhere, but it's probably not as prolific.
I think it's like part of what makes hip hop sort of exclusive. They're making this art that you can't like infiltrate because it's like, well, as like a white guy, right? Like I got a beat and I'm like hearing words and the words are coming in my head like rapping, and I rap and I listen to a lot of rap, but you know, in a lot of rap they use a word that would be really strange for me to say, and like what the way would I deliver that would be appropriate, you know?
And then too, it's like in terms of just playing the records in public, is a lot of people still don't want to hear that word.
Yeah,
and it's like that's fine. I'm not gonna. I cannot argue with you about that. Like that's you are 100% correct. And but it's like that rules out a lot of music I love to be able to play in public. But it has made me like when I'm thinking about these things, just try to be mindful of like who the audience is going to be. And it's like, I want people ultimately to be able to feel like welcome and included in things. So it's like, okay, well I have to think about that. Like I can't like, you know, I don't want to play these things that might potentially like bum somebody out or like hurt the feelings. So it's like, it's same thing with a lot of like bringing it back to the beginning part. It's like a lot of that music's not coming with me.
Yes.
Like a lot of that like more aggressive music. It's like I just can't really do that because it's just gonna, you know,
one of the last
subject matter there in that stuff that like I understand where that place is coming from, but like the random person sitting in the room might not. So it's like I don't want to throw them in the deep end.
Or yeah, even just like the way that the vocals are delivered could be just like nails on a chalkboard to somebody. You know,
to
so
most
like,
people.
You know, like so last time I went to Rob Burritos, I went with Randy and it was the school day, so we just had the little one and so like we're in there and we got like our normal. I got me a chicken burrito and she got, I forget, she got like a quesadilla or something. And I think we just kind of like, littlest one just nibbling on a little quesadilla. But like, you know, we're going in there and, you know, they got like, I'm going to say young people, right, working in there. They're going to play like their music that they like. And that was a thing that when you go there, it was always like, hey man, there's just going to be some like, you know, like music that you probably won't hear on the overhead radio at Lowe's. You know, like this is music that the employees are picking out from their own personal taste, and you might hear some cool music in there. Yeah, it was cool. And when I went in there, it was like there was another couple in there with like a little like a little girl, a little, you know, probably like 3 years old. And like the music that was being played, it was like they didn't change it song by song. It was like someone was letting an album play, and that album had like aggressive vocals as an element, but it was kind of weird because it broke into other stuff. It was just very, it felt like it was like Mr. Bungle, but not Mr. Bungle. And I think it just was just crazy. But I just remember just being like, oh man, like this song this music has a lot of profanity in it, and I'm like, oh wow, like I'm now like a person that would be like, I don't want to hear that right now, and and it was really just for the aggressiveness of the vocals, because it was like I'm trying to digest food that I'm paying a premium for, and it's just like I feel like I'm listening to someone like eating a microphone.
And I'm not in a comfortable environment, you know what I mean? It's just like, I hear you. Like, that's the things that I gotta be mindful of too in those situations, and it's just funny to think about because it's like I like so much obnoxious music. Or like, I'm not gonna like be in there playing the Butthole Surfers. It's just like it's not gonna It's not gonna work.
Anyway, I was about to go on some tangent about directions and getting lost or something, but like really, I don't know if I need to go there.
Yeah.
I mean, and I was thinking like this is gonna be the one where I'm like getting closer to striking that like a more brevity, but I'm certain this is probably lapsed well over an hour. All right.
Yeah.
Well,